Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Sara Pizano. I'm going to be presenting the best practice strategies today. I want to thank Maddie's Fund for this amazing forum for us all to exchange information and learn about best practices and all kinds of great information without leaving the comforts of our home. So thank you to Maddie's for this great opportunity. We do have a lot of people joining us today. If you do think of questions throughout the presentation, please keep in mind to get those in early so that we have time at the end for questions. My presentation today is about best practice strategies, and I am a veterinarian. I graduated from Cornell Veterinary School in 1994, but have been in animal welfare for about 30 years now. And I have experience on sort of all sides of animal welfare. I was a shelter veterinarian at North Shore Animal League, so got that private practice kind of education within a shelter, an amazing amount of medical care that we provided for the shelter animals. And I was also public shelter director myself. So as we go through the presentation, and to those of you in the audience in public shelters, municipal shelters, know that these principles are for everybody, and that is actually Target Bureau's target audience. And we want to actually start by celebrating all the amazing success in animal welfare over the years. We know so much more now than we ever have. We have technology to help us. Our data collection is so much more sophisticated. And thankfully now, because so many of us have advocated for shelter animals, that euthanasia is no longer acceptable as population control. And large shelters, municipal, rural, urban, all different types of shelters are proving that we can achieve amazing life-saving even within a municipal framework. But these best practices, please keep in mind there's such a wide variety in the audience today, and some are from small nonprofits and some are from larger organizations, again, private or public. Think of these principles as things that can work in your organization regardless of how large or small. And this next slide is a reminder to all of you and for me to remember that our philosophies and our beliefs and our policies evolve because of the information we have at the time. This advertisement is from the 50s, and back in the 50s, doctors were recommending smoking, especially if you had a lung problem. So you breathe in that smoke, hold a deep breath, get that nicotine through your pulmonary system. But now look at how we look and view smoking today. It's much different because we have different information. We have lots of data and studies to show that smoking is not good for us. So think about animal welfare in the same light. We tend to have these very strong beliefs and philosophies, but quite often they're not based on now what we know as current best practice. So Target Zero is the organization that I am with, and we provide shelter assessments and community assessments all over the United States. We look for leaders who are interested in implementing best practice and change, and we want to have some SpayNeuter infrastructure somewhere in the community and a desire for community cat diversion. And we are equal opportunity dogs and cats, but as you all know, cats have it much worse in our shelter system, so we're going to talk a lot about that. But how we deal or don't deal with cats in our shelters can benefit dogs as well. So our goal is to help shelters productively decrease intake by helping people and getting to that 90% or better live outcome. So we know that there will be some level of euthanasia in especially our open admission public shelters. We'll have aggressive dogs that we can't safely rehabilitate, those large dogs. And then we'll have advanced medical cases that we cannot help. So there will be a small pool of euthanasia always, but we have so many great shelters now proving that we can achieve that 90% or better, and it's a function of intake, which we're going to talk a lot about. Target Zero provides all these services and mentors these organizations for up to 3 years, and it's all pro bono. So if you're interested in learning more about us, please go on our website at target-zero.org, and we'd love to talk to you and see how we can help in your community. So again, it's about letting go of those common beliefs and those things that we've held near and dear to us for so many years. We made these policies with the best of intentions, but we often didn't have data or certainly any studies back, 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. Animal welfare was not as formalized as it is today, and now we have tremendous shelter medicine programs and residencies. We now have a specialty in shelter medicine. So we're more data-driven than ever, and that benefits the animals because things that we used to think were the right decisions, policies, laws, we now know different. And so we're obligated to do better. So what we're going to talk about today, the core of these best practices are shared amongst all the national animal welfare organizations. We may use some different terminology here and there, but the core of best practices really reaches amongst all of us. And Target Zero kind of puts them in a neat little bow for each organization that we work with. So for some of you that might be new to animal welfare, I just want to go over the basics and why there's sometimes, by definition, some discord between what the public views the shelter as and how shelters maybe interact with one another. So open admission shelters, there's two overarching types. You have open admission and limited admission shelters. Open admission shelters can be public or private. So private organizations are 501c3s or nonprofits. And then your open admission shelters are typically taking in a higher number of animals and typically have a lower save rate than the limited admission shelters. And again, I'm making general statements about most of these types of shelters. With our public open admission shelters, the major difference is that they are responsible for enforcement. And therein lies the point where I think shelters sometimes are struggling in this transition because we have been in our open admission shelters very enforcement minded, and when we try to create programs or maybe not create programs that are life-saving, we sometimes use the enforcement bubble, and that doesn't always work with our life-saving programs. And limited admission or your nonprofit shelters can then decide if they will or will not accept certain animals. So they can make their own rules with respect to who they do take into the shelter. Those shelters are sometimes called no-kill shelters as well, and they typically handle far fewer animals than the open admission shelters in their communities. So regardless of what the differences are between any of the organizations in your community or anywhere, the name of the game is public-private partnerships. We have to look at how we can capitalize on the strengths of all these different types of groups. We all bring different pieces of the puzzle that can be put together for life-saving, as opposed to using these differences as a divisive force that separates us and limits our life-saving. So if that's something that you take away from today's presentation, I'll be grateful, because this is how the magic happens in a community. And when we share responsibilities, perhaps it's job duties, perhaps it's part staff, part volunteer, whatever program we're talking about, it really can help catapult a program while being really cost effective. And then grant funding or municipal funding or fundraisers, all those things can be a great way to collaborate and capitalize on those strengths. So it's a win-win for everybody, but in particular the animals, because it really does exponentially save animals. So this can be as simple as a rescue group helping a municipal shelter. We have a great example in Aiken County, Georgia. The Friends of the Animal Shelter, they call themselves FOTUS, run the live outcome and volunteer programs for the most part at the county shelter. And it's such a great synergy and great partnership. And it's just a nice example of how a nonprofit and a municipality can work under the same roof side by side with a common goal. So it could be as simple, like I said, as a rescue group helping a municipal shelter, or it could be complicated, and this is one of our most recent projects that I wanted to talk about for several reasons. So Target Zero started out looking at individual counties, but then when we had the opportunity to look at a region in northern Kentucky, we thought, well, this is a great way to get a bigger bang for our buck and help more communities at once. And so in the state of Kentucky, there are development districts, and they're made up of about 9 to 15 counties per district. In northern Kentucky, it's 8 counties, so they have 8 shelters. 4 of those shelters handle only dogs, and 4 handle cats and dogs. So we had started to work with them, and the groups there said, well, we have the offer of funding from the Joni Bernard Foundation, which does exclusively cats, but we've maxed the amount of money that we can receive from them. So when Target Zero came in, we sort of looked at all the players and said, wait a minute, you have a funder, and then you have this government entity which exists to solve social problems and all those programs for people, not having anything to do with animal welfare, but they had a nonprofit arm. So we asked them, having never before done anything in animal welfare, we asked the NCAD director, would it be possible for your nonprofit arm to accept this grant from this foundation and then administer the grant and reimburse service providers? And they said yes. So that's what happened. And those 8 counties have also private veterinarians as service providers that we've recruited and are still recruiting. And when I say we, I mean all of us on the slide, all the counties and the nonprofit SpayNeuter clinics in the Cincinnati area, which one is OR that does cats and dogs, and one is UCAN. And so the model of this story and the reason it's such an important story is twofold. One is nobody ever asked the right question. So nobody ever approached the NCAD nonprofit arm. So just because there's an entity or perhaps even a large funder or a local community foundation, just because they've never done anything in animal welfare doesn't mean that it won't happen. You just have to ask. The Joni Bernard Foundation, we had started to work with them in 2013. They had not previously funded public shelters because of the euthanasia rates. And so we said, but that's where you should put the money to make the biggest impact on life-saving. And so we did a SpayNeuter analysis in that region, and $500,000 was awarded for this program as of October 1st. And I know some of you are thinking, well, we don't have that much money, and we don't even have $50,000 or $50. We don't have that kind of money where we are. And this is, again, a big example, a big, huge example of a successful program. But I submit to you that program design at your shelters or within your nonprofit rescue organizations perhaps Doesn't matter, again, big or small. Your program design is going to be the most important thing, and the funding is the second most important thing. So when we started October 1st, we had the service providers set up throughout these counties. And the other thing that we had to do, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is we did have to update ordinances in these counties to allow for community cats to be diverted instead of going into the shelter to be sterilized, ear tip, rabies vaccinated, and returned back to their outside home. So in Campbell, Kenton, and Boone counties, within a month in the fall, between the summer and fall, we were able to help revise those ordinances and allow for this program. So look what happened in the first 2 months. Now, the save rates, when we're comparing, the 49% in Campbell County was from January 2016 to September, and then same thing with Kenton. And that's their save rate was 49% and 42%. And in just the first 2 months, October and November of this program, because we returned those community cats to their outside homes, the save rates went to 94 and 77 respectively. So huge, huge impact. And again, a very elaborate, complicated public-private partnership with lots of players, but the more people you get involved, the better. And remember that success attracts success. I just want to remind everybody, too, that if you do have questions throughout the presentation, to get those in early so we're not so we make sure we get to as many questions as possible. So start submitting questions now if you do have any, or throughout the presentation. So we are at this tipping point, and as Target Zero travels around the country and talks to lots of different leaders and shelter leadership and municipal leadership around the country, we definitely see there's two schools of thought. And one is that old school, this is how we've always done it, this is what our laws say. And then the progressive, we went and tried this new program, we knew other programs that are successful. So I do, and I think a lot of us sense that we're at this incredible tipping point. And that's why I'm so grateful there were so many people registered for this seminar today, because it means that we want to do things differently. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so this is the perfect opportunity. Again, think of that smoking commercial from the 50s. We need to change our perspective. We need to step back and step out of the box and say, we need to look at doing business differently. So what we at Target Zero look at is we have very laser-focused goals. When we research a community, when we do those assessments, and as we help implement these best practices around the country, we are laser-focused on these things. We want to help people keep their pets out of the shelter system by helping them maybe keep their pets, or helping them place their pets out of the shelter system or outside the shelter system, or maybe turning Good Samaritans into foster volunteers. That's what we mean by productively decreasing intake. This is a very important message. Again, I'm going to repeat this because this is a very important message. We are not talking about shutting the door in people's faces at intake. We are saying, how can we help you? How can we help you keep your pet or help you place your pet outside of the shelter system? Again, we've never asked those questions before. And then if animals do have to enter our shelter system, how can we get them to the best possible placement as soon as possible? We all know that increased length of stay at any shelter, even the most state-of-the-art shelter, is correlated with negative things. Overcrowding, higher levels of infectious disease, therefore higher costs of medical care, therefore less people wanting to adopt, and yes, less rescues able to pull because of the infectious diseases, and therefore higher euthanasia rates. So getting them out of the shelter to the best possible outcome is something we should really be obsessed about, and not say, oh, they're in the shelter, phew, they're safe, like well, they could just stay here till we get them a home. And I think about my own pets at home and ask myself, how long would I want my pets in the shelter? And I know the answer for me is I wouldn't. It would be 0. So as close to 0 as possible is how long they should be in the shelter to get them to that best possible placement. And we also look at getting to that 90% or better, and that is sort of, we know that there can be some pluses and minuses there depending on what's happening in an organization, but in general, we do think that getting over a 90% live outcome is absolutely doable for every shelter. But again, I know that most of you are thinking, holy cow, we take in X animals. I can't imagine being able to save over 90% of them. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about productively decreasing intake, because if I think about me being on a deserted island off the coast of the United States and everybody's bringing their animals to me, even though everybody in the United States could help, I'm the one in this desert island that has to save all these animals. So do I want to have that responsibility to save 5,000 or 5? Well, it's going to be much easier for me to save 5. So we need to also think about our live outcome as a function of decreasing intake. It's so, so important, and I think it's something that we haven't typically had that perspective. I think me and a lot of other people have always thought we need to save more animals in the number of animals, but the name of the game is productively decreasing intake and helping people. And then the other goal, laser focused, again, goes back to those public-private partnerships. We all are in this business because we care passionately about animals and we want them to be treated humanely. But for a lot of us, we don't always get treated humanely ourselves. So treating pets and people with compassion is important. And when you have disagreements about something, to listen to one another and work together, put your differences aside and work together on behalf of the animals, because that's the most important part. So getting them, again, laser-focused goals, getting them to the best possible placement as soon as possible is going to result in the most animals being saved. So when we look at organizations, and what we would love for all of you to do is look at what, and this could be, doesn't matter if it's all volunteers or all staff, it doesn't matter, a combination of whatever, is every dollar, is everything, is every minute of our time, is every resource pointing to these laser-focused goals of helping people keep their pets or place their pets or getting to that 90% or better. And if it is not, if we are doing something that is not directly making a positive impact, then we need to stop doing it. And we need to reallocate our resources. So these are just some examples of, we call them fellows, and these are organizations that we take on and help for up to a period of 3 years. And I love talking about Waco, Texas, because that town has a 30% poverty rate. So when we started there, the leadership was like, well, we would love to, have you help, but we're just too poor. It's just not going to work here. And they were saving 36% of the shelter animals. But they, right out of the gate, started implementing the recommendations that we're talking about in this assessment. And 2 years later, they were at 91%. And now, then they just finished their second year at over 90%. So these are huge increases in the percentage of animals saved. And I'm going to show you some really great slides that talk about and show the function of decreasing intake. So, and this happens to be an example of Waco, just to make the point about that dramatic impact that decreasing shelter intake has on our euthanasia rates or our save rates. So the whole bar is the shelter intake. the green is the live outcome, and the blue is euthanasia. So that first bar is before we started working in Waco, and over time you see that they did not get to 90% because they saved more animals, meaning the number of animals. They got there as a function of decreasing intake. So I think this bar graph is just a beautiful illustration of that point. So again, it's about asking the right questions. So in our shelters, a lot of times we've just sat in our box inside the walls of our shelter and thought, oh my gosh, we have no control over, even though we might be called animal control, we have no control over all these animals coming in, and we're just sitting inside our box just getting piled and piled and piled with animals. We need to break down those walls and look in the community and see where those animals are coming from, who's bringing them in, are they owner surrenders, are they strays. We need to design our program around these answers. So the number or percent of strays versus owner surrenders is a very important number to have. And for example, owner surrenders, in 2015, the ASPCA did a retrospective study and found that 30 to 40% of people that surrendered to shelter did not want to. They just needed temporary help, but nobody asked them what they needed, or nobody had resources for them, and so they had to surrender. And our intake staff, because we're human, we default to the negative. So in communities, every single organization we talk to, the intake staff is the first to say, oh, that'll never work here. That'll never work here. We've tried it. Because our brains always go to the negative. So if we had 100 amazing experiences today and one bad one at 11:30 this morning, we're going to go home and have a nightmare about that bad one at 11:30. We need to be open about asking and designing the right programs and asking the right questions. The other thing is that Peter Marsh is he's one of our co-founders, as a matter of fact. He's written 2 amazing books, Replacing Myth with Math and Getting to Zero, and his research showed some very crucial characteristics that are so important to this picture, that obviously a lot of us know that most of the animals that are entering our shelters are intact, and that's because they're from low-income pet owners. The majority of our shelter pets are from low-income pet owners. It is not true that they do not want to sterilize their pets. They just did not have access. Even a low-cost opportunity at $70 or $80 was out of reach for them. And then Maddie's fund, also in 2015, did a survey that showed that even though open admission shelters need the most help, they're the least likely to ask. And that when we ask, for example, a good Samaritan, we've trained the public, right? If you find a litter or puppies, dogs running down, whatever, you bring them to a shelter. But we've never at that point said, wait a minute, you're a good Samaritan, you cared enough to stop, you cared enough to bring them in. If we give you the supplies, will you foster them? And that is how you build an amazing volunteer program, foster volunteer program. So Maddie showed that people are more likely to become foster volunteers at that point of intake if you give them supplies. For example, it might be the formula for the babies, it might be food, but definitely the spay and neuter and the vaccines, that they are more likely to become your foster volunteers. And then it builds from there, because they tell 2 friends and they tell 2 friends. So again, looking out at the big picture, a bird's eye view of what's happening. An outdated public policy is a very big problem in animal welfare, not just with our local ordinances, but at our state levels as well. And so we look at we work on the local level for the most part, but we made these, again, just like those policies I was talking about earlier. We made these ordinances and laws with the best of intentions. But remember, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, some of these ordinances have been in place. we didn't have data. We just thought, well, we think this is the best thing to do to get the most positive outcome. And we now know differently. So there's ways that we can revise our public policies and actually create more fiscally responsible programs that everybody wants. So our elected officials want that. It's better for our shelters. It's better for the animals when we allocate our resources intelligently. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than having an ordinance or a state law being a barrier to life-saving when that is not why they were created. Our public shelters and our public policies were created to protect dangerous animals, protect animals from dangerous people and protect people from dangerous animals. And so we have to keep those laws very focused on making sure that our intentions are actually going to produce the results that we want. Now we have data. So what it should look like is we should look at, for example, our shelter stats. We have to have all this data analyzed and know what our numbers are. So, for example, and these are just some antiquated examples, we know, and the ASPCA says that less than 5% of stray cats are returned to their owners from shelters, and we know that most cats are euthanized at shelters, and it's a huge, huge problem everywhere, except for some very fortunate pockets in the United States. But why then do we have a 3-day stray hold or a 5-day stray hold, or even what we've seen recently, a 7-day stray hold for cats when less than 5%, and a lot of the ones that we work with are far below that, far below 1%. That's not actually producing the end result. So we did that because we want people to find their cats in our shelters and get reunited with them. But that is not happening, and we have a better way, and we know better now. So these are just a couple of other examples. Pet limits, we are, again, from the enforcement-minded side, we are exposed in our microcosms. We are exposed to hoarders and people who are abusing animals and being irresponsible. And so therefore, we think we should create a public policy that limits the number of pets, when in fact that has no bearing on how somebody will or will not care for a pet, because I could have one pet and that's my max, and my neighbor could have 20 pets and they take care of their pets just as well as I do my one pet. So again, thinking about, is this actually producing the result that I need? And looking now, we have so much proof of a lot of great shelters that are really, I call them mythbusters, that are proving that these innovative programs are making a lot of sense. So with Target Zero, we have two since this slide went up. We have also Columbia, South Carolina, and Greenville County, South Carolina. So we've been involved in helping update ordinances in all these places around the United States. So we're 12 for 12. So we've tried 12 times to update ordinances, and we have succeeded 12 times. And that's because we present our decision makers, we meet with our elected officials, and again, we work directly with open admission shelters. So when I say we, I mean the open admission shelter director. We meet with the elected officials and we explain, here's what your ordinance says, here's what the data is at your shelter, and here's what's happening around the country, and here's what best practice is currently. And we have concise data, and we look at the goal and what it has or has not accomplished with respect to organizing those public policies. We want to help elected officials create sustainable, we call it sustainable resolution for these issues. And we see a lot of ordinances that are not doing that right now. It's also really important to listen to the concerns and fears of not just the public and people who might have questions about certain public policies, but the elected officials. And when we had a recent meeting with the county attorney, and this is a very common question, and they said, well, we don't want to remove the stray hold for cats because we want people to be reunited with their cats. So when we told them and gave them the data from their shelter and what the national averages were, they understood. So we need to listen, though, to what they're concerned about and all work together to help accomplish the same goals. So very, very important piece of best practice is not just looking at what happens in the four walls of your shelter or your organization. Another piece of this puzzle to look at from a global view is targeted SpayNeuter. And targeted SpayNeuter means I'm going to choose populations of animals or people, and when I heavily subsidize those programs, I'm going to decrease shelter intake. And so we know that when we target fixed income pet owners, and this is again through Peter Marsh's research, based on the knowledge that most of the animals in shelters are from fixed income pet owners, when we heavily subsidize the spay-neuter, and that's $20 or less, preferably free, when we do that, at least 5 of those subsidized surgeries per 1,000 residents a year, there's a decrease in shelter intake, and it's repeatable, and it works everywhere, every time. This is one of the big things that worked in Waco, Texas. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphs as well. Large dogs, I don't have to tell you, once they enter the shelter system, it's exponentially harder to save their lives. So important to have targeted programs in your community to subsidize the sterilization of those dogs. And Community Cats has its own special section because that is a little bit of a hot button still. And then your high intake areas. So when we look at a community-minded approach, we all know where our high intake areas are and do sort of a Pets for Life program in those areas. We can turn those high intake areas into low intake areas. So this first graph is from Jacksonville, Florida, and the first line on the bottom that's sort of orange or yellow, at least on my screen, is the number of targeted surgeries. So you can, and the other, the red and the blue, are the shelter intake and euthanasia. So you can see there's a direct inverse correlation between targeted surgeries and intake and euthanasia. The next one is Waco, Texas, which you could actually overlay on Jacksonville. Number of targeted surgeries goes up, and euthanasia and intake goes down. So I really encourage you, even if you had just a little bit of spay-neuter money, to make sure you're getting those people that need it the most, and that is that income-targeted population of people. The reason this Huntsville, Alabama slide is so important is because it's the only thing that changed in Huntsville during these years from 2008 to present is that one person started a nonprofit and said, I want to fund income-targeted spay-neuter, and there are no high-volume spay-neuter clinics there. This has always been done through a network of private veterinarians, and so about 2,000 surgeries a year have been done over the course of this slide. I think it's since 2008, and look what happened to shelter intake and euthanasia. Again, decreased by almost half. The city of Huntsville then halfway through said, well, wait a minute, we think you're onto something, so we're going to throw in some money too. And talk about cutting their cost of care. So now instead of having to deal with 10,000 animals, they're dealing with 5,000 animals. So if animals do enter the shelter system, again, we have to make sure that all our policies and procedures are streamlined, that we have policies that make sense, that we're not just making a global policy that affects thousands of animals because in 1982 one thing happened and whatever, we got sued or something bad happened, there was some sort of negative outcome, and we want to prevent that from happening again. So we make these gargantuan policies that negatively affect an exponential number of animals. So encouraging you to think about doing what's right for the animals, making sure you have data collection and are looking at trends, and that you have effective population management. So again, if an animal is entering your shelter, you have a live outcome team. I make sure there's a plan of action for every single pet so that they get out of the shelter as soon as possible. Maybe that's foster to adopt. So during the stray hold, my municipal attorney or my organization's attorney says, here's a contract, I'm going to be a foster parent for this pet, and if the owner comes back, I know during the stray hold I have to bring them back. So just in an effort, again, to get that flow of animals out to live outcome to the best possible scenario. And then poor management of staff and finances goes back to that previous slide about making sure that every single thing you're doing is laser focused towards the goals that you are trying to achieve, and that is saving animals. So community cats, thankfully, isn't the hot button that it used to be, but we used to be afraid to stand up in a room, 10 years ago and talk about community cats because you get rotten tomatoes thrown at you. But now I feel like it is kind of catching on and sweeping the nation. And thanks to programs like the Million Cat Challenge that Maddie's graciously funds and so many amazing programs around the country, we have amazing and a plethora, certainly, of information that community cat diversion works. Now, with respect to terminology, Target Zero, we love TNR in the field. We love it. But, again, we are laser focused on what's happening at the shelter and that point of intake. So when we say community cat diversion, we're talking about cats entering the shelter. But we want TNR to happen. We need it to happen. But with our very limited resources when we're working with individual shelters, the crisis is those cats that are entering the shelter. So now we have facts and studies and data that we didn't have before. So Dr. Linda Ward and Owen, there's a couple of great studies out there that show that cats are 7 to 10 times more likely to find their way home from the street than a shelter, or more likely to find another home on the street than a shelter. We know that a lot of people let their cats in and out, and we know that in the shelters that we have done assessments on, and it's about 40 shelters, the RTO rate is far less than 2%, and most of them less than 1%. We know that when we trap and euthanize cats and take no action in the field, that we didn't solve any problem, but remove and euthanize one cat. And we know that the majority of cats in shelters today are at risk of euthanasia. So what we're saying is, and what we call community cat diversion, some people call it shelter neuter return or return to field, things like that. You might hear all different kinds of titles, but we call it community cat diversion. And what we're talking about is instead of bringing that outside cat into the shelter, they get diverted to a SpayNeuter program. They get ear tipped, rabies and booster vaccinated, perhaps dewormed, and put right back where they were found. Now, we know based on their body condition and their healthy body condition that they have a food source, and most of them have multiple food sources. I will tell you my disclaimer that way back when, 20 years ago, I thought this was crazy. I said, I couldn't do that. I don't know who's feeding them. I don't know what their address is. I don't know if they're going to get Friskies tonight. But again, we have better information now. And look at me now, I'm the preacher. So talk about a major philosophical shift. This program changes everything. And if you will, a lot of times when we talk about these programs, people trigger to, well, we don't have the staff, or we don't have the money, or we don't have on-site SpayNeuter, or whatever, and why we can't do this program. But remember, everybody can hold a piece of the puzzle. And all the communities that are doing this now, they haven't been doing it forever. They started somewhere. You start small, you build up, you build resources, you build public-private partnerships so that it's not on the backs of a private organization or on the backs of a public organization. It is a collaboration. So there are many ways logistically to make this program work. So there's a couple of critical points and that we hear repeatedly, and that we talk about the stray hold and the lost cats and reunification and all of that. We don't believe these cats are stray. We know that many people let their cats inside and out. We know that a lot of cats like living outside. And then we're talking, again, what I should clarify too is we're talking about friendlies and feral. And the friendlies that come to the shelter are friendly because they have at least one home, and they are more likely picked up by a Good Samaritan between having breakfast at my house and walking down the street and having dinner at my neighbor's house. And in the middle, a Good Samaritan says, oh my goodness, you are a lost cat. I better take you to the shelter so your owner can find them, when we now know that that doesn't happen to the degree that we need it to happen. And that is because people let their cats outside. Now, we want them to be identified and all of those things, and we would love for people to look for their cats at shelters, certainly, and we're not saying that. But community cat diversion returns them to their outside home. So we consider this a return to owner, if you will. I may not know who's feeding the cat, but the cat is 10 pounds, 12 pounds, healthy body coat. And so we know that he has at least one food source. Now, the positives in the community, in this program, I don't know any downside to this program. In the community now, remember, if I just trap and euthanize, all those cats are exponentially reproducing. Nobody's vaccinated against rabies. But now I had started with 2 cats. I sterilized them and I rabies vaccinated them. Now I have increased my community immunity against rabies. This is about colony prevention. People and cats get into trouble when the cats reproduce exponentially. And colonies is when then the neighbors start complaining or the businesses start complaining. So this is about preventing colonies. Now, if I have less cats outside, there's less wildlife at risk, which we care about all creatures, and so we have to worry less about wildlife. It also, one amazing thing, and again, in the interest of full disclosure, one thing I worried about doing this at my shelter way back when was that everybody would complain. Well, it turned out that every single shelter that implements this program virtually eliminates complaints about cats, which is amazing but makes sense because most of the complaints are associated with their intact behaviors. And again, because they're exponentially reproducing, so once you eliminate those behaviors or you stop attracting the male cats to that female in heat, your complaints go away. And then, of course, you have less parasites. So in the environment, because you have less cats. So positives at the shelter, probably I have to admit, nothing that I thought I would ever see in my lifetime, that we have empty cat cages because they were all saved as opposed to being euthanized. And that makes me want to cry. because we look back and say, gosh, why didn't we know this then? Why didn't we do things differently? And that's why we're so passionate about getting the word out about best practices, because this can eliminate the unnecessary euthanasia of cats in shelters. And not only that, those cats, there's less competition for adoption for the cats that do have to enter your shelter, so your inside-only cats that come into the shelter, perhaps your declawed cats. So now our shelters that are doing this, and I remember going back to Waco, and after, 2 years before they had euthanized a couple thousand cats in 1 year, there was 3 cats in adoptions because they were all saved, and 1 cat was blind, and he got adopted the next day. In Indianapolis, when we went back, there was a cat, he had to be 20 years old. He got adopted because there's no competition. And those were the cats that would have gotten euthanized first. Now, mind you, I'm telling you about cats with issues, but there's still lots of healthy cats in shelters, believe me. But again, just decreases the competition. So the adoption of cats really shoots through the roof in an amazing, amazing way. So if you're a dog person and you don't even like cats, I would encourage you to support community cat diversion, because then you have more resources for safety net, for keeping dogs out of the shelter, or if they do enter the shelter system, you have more staff, more time, more money, more resources, all of those things to help get those dogs out of the shelter as quickly as possible. This changes everything, and it makes sense for the shelter, it makes sense for the cats, and it makes sense for the dogs. So Greenville County, an amazing, amazing transformation under Shelley Simmons, who's one of our rock star directors, and we're so proud of the Greenville team. And what this slide is projecting is in May and June, just 2 months, in 2015, you can see that orange bar is the number of cats, over 1,500 cats that Good Samaritans brought in. These are outdoor cats. And then a year later, same 2-month period, we did, in the middle of these 2 data points, we were happy to help Greenville get a SpayNeuter grant, and they do have a beautiful on-site SpayNeuter clinic. But again, everybody can bring a piece of the puzzle. We know that everybody doesn't have all the resources at their fingertips, but what they could say to these Good Samaritans is, hey, would you be able to take this cat to our SpayNeuter clinic? We'll pay for the surgery. Could you pick him up and put him back where you found him or where you were feeding him? And half the time people said yes. So look at that phenomenal decrease in shelter intake from 1 year to the next, just a 2-month time period. And the blue bar is ACOs. Again, we want to be laser focused, and we want our enforcement teams to be dealing with public safety issues. And so we said, listen, stop being a taxi for healthy cats whose owners aren't going to come to the shelter for them. Only bring in the cats that absolutely have to come to the shelter. So perhaps your rabies suspects, your injured, hoarding cases, what have you. And look at what happened in the ACO intake. It went from 255 to 10 in the same 2-month time period a year later. Just remarkable, remarkable progress and achievement in such a short period of time, just from thinking about things differently and setting up a program for success. So Feral Freedom started in Jacksonville, and now, I mean, it is Friendlies and Feral, but the name's kind of stuck because it started out thinking that, they thought, well, it's just about ferals, but turns out it's about the Friendlies too. And so you can see in that first bar, again, the green is live outcome and the blue is euthanasia. Almost 11,000 cats lost their lives that year. And in the first year of the program, over 5,400 cats went through the program, and my teammate Cameron Moore was given the task of taking all the complaint calls. She was at the nonprofit SpayNeuter clinic. She was at First Coast, and the public shelter said, we'll do this program, like you can have the cats, but we're going to give Cameron's personal cell phone because we don't want to deal with all the complaints. And Cameron was shaking in her shoes because she thought she was just going to be sniped in the parking lot. But after 5,400 cats in 1 year, Cameron got about 12 calls, and they were all calls from constituents that she could help. Now, mind you, there's always going to be that guy who's going to complain about the potholes and the street lights and everything else. So there's going to be some people that every once in a while you can't appease, but that is very few and far between. It was more likely the wife was feeding her cats on the porch, and the husband didn't want the other cat from the neighbor's yard on his porch type of thing. So this is actually, we hear this from every community that does it, but we just don't get complaints. So again, if you can appreciate the next several slides, the power of targeted spay-neuter and community cat diversion, you can see that the intake over time in Jacksonville at the shelters went down, and again is a function of how that community has been in the 90s for several years now. It's not because the numbers of cats were saved, an increased number of cats were saved. So this is Huntsville. They started community cat diversion in the middle of 2014, which is why there's that big jump in live outcome. And remember, this is the community that's been doing all that amazing income-targeted spay-neuter over the years. In Indianapolis, this program started in 2013, so you do see a jump there in the live outcome. But again, over time, because of their amazing nonprofit spay-neuter clinics based in Indianapolis, they've seen a decrease in intake and euthanasia over the years. So the next topic is another taking you to bird's eye view and looking at what is happening before animals enter the shelter. This is sometimes called safety net, managed intake, surrender prevention. But what's so great about our virtual education today is you can look at any of our national organizations and look at their blogs and webinars, and there's so many great examples of these programs all over the country. But again, this means that we're going to try to help people keep their pets, see what they need, or place their pets outside of the shelter system. This can be done all with in-kind donations and volunteers. This doesn't even have to be increase your budget, although it would be nice to have funding for this, but there's lots of simple ways that we can help. Perhaps it's crisis foster care and somebody has a medical problem and needs help for short term, a month or two, but their only option is to surrender to the shelter. If you had a crisis foster care program, then you could prevent that surrender and that pet could go back with their owner. Now, Maddie's fund survey I already told you about, that Good Samaritans were most likely to be turned into foster volunteers if they were offered supplies and services, and you have to make sure those animals are spay-neutered. But imagine if I'm just a regular Joe Schmo and I find a litter of puppies, 5 puppies, how many people can sterilize and vaccinate all those puppies? So instead of taking them into the shelter system, it's actually saving me money to have that foster volunteer care for them, and then when they're old enough, I sterilize them and vaccinate them, just like I would have if they did enter into the shelter system. But this is a major area of focus now for our national funders, so you need to be on the lookout for some grant opportunities coming up. ASPCA had one last year. So Brevard County is one of our fellows, and the sheriff's office took over about 2 years ago, and we told him that we wanted him to set up this safety net program, and he did. He actually designated a staff person, and in the very first year of this program, that staff person and the Brevard team successfully helped 80% of the owners that were surrendering to the shelter. That means 80% of the dogs and 80% of the cats would have otherwise entered the shelter system did not, because we asked what they needed and we asked how we could intervene, and we scheduled appointments if there was no other options for them or we couldn't find a resolution for them. But again, an 80% of those owners actually were assisted outside of the shelter system. So this is, again, a very important point. We are not talking about turning people away or saying, good luck, see you later. We're not going to help you because we don't want to take animals into the shelter. It's not that at all. We want what's best for the animals, and that means keeping them out of the shelter and in the best possible place. And maybe it means that owner will foster them while we're looking for a home or until our next offsite adoption event or what have you. But just a great example, the sheriff is an elected official, and so he wants his constituents to be happy, certainly. So this is a great example of a public shelter that has been far more successful with this program. We told them, gosh, if you can divert 30% of the owner surrenders, we're going to celebrate and we're going to pop champagne. They went ahead and diverted 80%. So a huge, huge success story. And the other thing that we see about this when we talk about managed intake or these safety net programs is we've had, and remember the target audience for Target Zero is shelters that are struggling, so they have low save rates, and they often say to us, oh yes, we are going to do managed intake, we have that in, we're thinking about doing that next year. Well, why wouldn't that be the first thing you did? Again, I'm on my little desert island. I want to see how I can spread the wealth and cast that net and get as much help as I can from the community and from Good Samaritans. This should be the first program that I develop, not the last one. So the reason live release and live outcome programs is last because we want people to think about that bird's eye view, and we want people to think about all the opportunities we have to make the shelter system and the flow of animals in and out of the shelter the easiest and quickest trip, if you will, that it can possibly be. So once we've implemented all these different programs, now we're left with, okay, we have these animals in the shelter. We didn't have another option for them. So now what are we, how are we going to get to 90 and sustainably stay over 90% live outcome? First of all, with our enforcement teams, those ACOs, we want them equipped to reunite animals in the field, so they should all have microchip scanners. They should have a way to communicate with dispatch or have internet access so they can even go on AHA microchip lookup and try to reunite in the field at all. If they can find the owners and they have a tag, however they can get them home, that is the ultimate goal, to keep them out of the shelter system. Then the next one, and I, after rereading this slide, I realized I don't want this to be misinterpreted when I say incentive and mandatory to SpayNeuter and microchip. I'm talking about return to owners. We don't have any proof that mandatory SpayNeuter laws are effective. Again, what we know is when we have accessible programs that are income targeted for those people that truly need it, that we can make a difference. So making a mandatory SpayNeuter law, all it's going to do is spend enforcement money, and once again, we're not addressing the root, and once again, we've created an ordinance that is not helping us achieve our ultimate goal of decreasing the number of litters that are born and that might be unwanted. And then with our return to owners, we also have seen a strange phenomenon of not posting pictures on intake because of a fear that people might come in and steal the animals and it might not be the rightful owner. So that's not, I don't think, a feasible or rational way to look at it. We should, if we're entering the shelter system, there should be a picture posted on our websites and on all the search engines and on our Facebook page in real time, so that when that owner realizes their pet is missing, they take to the internet, they see their pet in real time. And it goes without saying, convenient hours, according to the Shelter Association of Shelter Veterinarian Guidelines, being open convenient hours means at least one weekend day and then at least 1 or 2 evenings a week, but making sure that the hours are convenient for the public. One amazing program that we actually had the opportunity to meet with is in Port St. Lucie, and the police department in the city of Port St. Lucie actually has a shelter, a small shelter, where they hold dogs and cats for 3 days, and then they transfer them to a local nonprofit. But for last year, they had a return to owner rate that was about 50%. So that's a really amazing rate. They make sure with the licensing that the microchip information is accurate, and one of the highest RTO rates that we've heard of, and that is in the first 3 days. And that reminds me of another recommendation for responsible public policy is looking at your stray hold periods, and hopefully if your state laws don't prohibit this, but that most of the return to owners are happening within those, for definitely within 3 days, a lot of times within 24 hours, 36 hours. So having those long stray holds, like 5 or 7 days, doesn't, again, help us accomplish our goal, and again, leads us to all those negative outcomes like overcrowding, like infectious disease, like higher euthanasia rates. So making sure you analyze not just what your return to owner rates are, but when those animals are coming back. So if you have the opportunity to update your ordinances, some very crucial information to have for your elected officials. So open adoptions is, I think, still a problem, and I think all of us have had again, all these long-held beliefs and fears about placing our shelter animals and being very paranoid about them getting into the wrong hands. But what we submit to you as not embracing open adoptions is an absolute a barrier to life-saving. So open adoptions means that I am going to welcome you to my shelter. It's going to be a nice environment. Even if you're in a very old shelter, it can still be a nice environment with good customer service. And we're going to make it an easy process, and you're going to be able to see all the animals in our shelter, except for the ones that might be court cases or cruelty or dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. But we're going to make it an easy process. We're going to have it be a partnership with you, and we're going to talk about what your lifestyle's like and what you're looking for. And this is opposed to other things that we have seen, such as, and I'm going to give you some examples of what we've seen. So an adoption contract with every single bullet threatening some sort of enforcement action if you don't do something. An adoption contract, because you are responsible for SpayNeuter on your own and you have to pay for it, there is a court date set anticipating your noncompliance, and you only get that court date removed or canceled if you submit your proof, checking a notarized letter from your landlord, checking or calling veterinarians, doing home checks. Those are all examples of closed adoptions that don't welcome people to our shelters. And we understand why this is, and I hope that everybody, if you haven't read it, you go home tonight and for homework you read Adopters Welcome Guide, and that is on animalsheltering.org. The Humane Society of the United States put it out last year. It is hands down one of the best documents I've seen in animal welfare ever. It has, and I know for me it really helped me change a lot of beliefs and perspectives that I had historically as well. One of the things that we've done especially in our municipal shelters, is because we are enforcement and we all started out as enforcement, that we kind of design our adoption programs almost like an enforcement program. This is because of the microcosm that we are in and the people that we see on the street, meaning, your ACOs and investigators and those abuse cases, cruelty, irresponsible pet owners, hoarders, fighters, all those types of things. But here's what you'll learn in Adopters Welcome. There are 144 million dogs and cats that are in homes today in the United States. 144 million. There's about 6 to 8 million that end up going through a shelter system. And then there's a fraction, a very, very small fraction of those 6 to 8 million that are victims of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Yet, when people come to our shelters to adopt, we are so nervous that they might be one of those minuscule percentage of people that are horrible. And so that is just a great example of how we have to get out of our own way and understand and trust that most people that are coming to our shelter are really going to be good pet owners, and it's a better situation for those pets than being in a shelter. Now, adoption fees is a touchy subject with a lot of organizations. If it's municipal, we often have the bean counters saying, well, we have to recoup the cost of care. This is, we're putting all this money in doing SpayNeuter, et cetera, hopefully providing SpayNeuter and vaccines, et cetera. We have to make that money back. And then your nonprofits have to raise revenue just to operate. So the thing is, and what you'll again read about in Adopters Welcome, is we should and should not use adoption fees as a needed revenue source, because the higher our adoption fees, the lower the number of animals saved. So and with cats, the recommendation now is fee waived, and the logic is that our competition is free cats on the street. So keeping the adoption fees low gets more animals out alive. And again, something that I always said, well, I want to know that they can afford it and that they're serious and blah, blah, blah. Well, we now know that it's not correlated. We can't judge an adopter based on how much they can afford or are willing to pay for an adoption. What is making the difference is positioning my organization as a resource after adoption and making sure that I'm helping any way I possibly can if there's some sort of issue. That's what matters, and that's where we should spend our time, not judging people out of an adoption. We're missing a lot of adoption opportunities, and again, it's just something that we need to just lift the veil and get out of our own way. And I just beg you to read Adopters Welcome and buy copies for everybody. You can download it for free. You could read it online for free or print it out, but really, really can't encourage you enough. And a great gift for other organizations that might be struggling with this. And so our rescue partnerships, again, this has to do with those public-private partnerships and open admission shelters. So we want to make sure that rescue partners are a big piece of this with our municipal and open admission shelters. Obviously, there's an approval process and that they're working legally and caring for the animals, but that there's no fees for rescue partners, and that we're not just asking them to take the hard medical and behavior cases. We often hear complaints that, oh, rescue groups want to just cherry pick. Well, we say, we're not going to run out of animals anytime soon. Let them cherry pick. Let them get animals adopted and into the right homes as quickly as possible. So we want rescue partners to also have the same open adoption philosophy. And, of course, we want the shelters to have a streamlined process for them. So we are almost done. And if you all could send in any of your questions. I'm going to be wrapping it up here if you have any questions to submit. So the last slide and section is about foster care and adoption ambassadors, and I mentioned several times about turning those good Samaritans into foster volunteers and how important it is to provide those supplies and services for them. Give them opportunities like an off-site adoption event or perhaps a special Facebook page, some sort of outlet to place pets. Empower them to make those permanent placements. And again, this is something 10 years ago I was thinking, why didn't I think of this? It was so insane how we used to do this is foster, especially those babies, the most vulnerable population, puppies and kittens, go out to foster care, they're nice and safe, they're not exposed to infectious disease, and then we bring them back in the shelter. So not only is it a double intake for us, it's exposing those babies. So let's empower our foster volunteers to actually make those placements. And we're seeing this much more frequently now. It's really exciting, but they also have to have the open adoption philosophy. So this can work like a well-oiled machine if everybody is embracing the same sort of mission and philosophy of getting and either preventing animals from coming into the shelter and getting them out to the best possible placement as soon as possible. So I'm going to ask Allison to come on the line, and we're going to be ready for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pizano. That was a great information-packed presentation. My name is actually Jessie. I'm an online specialist with Maddie's Fund. I know many of you have been asking for access to the PowerPoint presentation. This presentation will be available on demand tomorrow, and we will be placing a PDF version, which will be available to everyone on that web page. Okay, so we're going to be taking questions now. Here is our first question. Dr. Pizano, how long on average has it taken to update the ordinances?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it varies. Probably the quickest, 8 months maybe the quickest, 6 months. And it really depends. It depends on where the commissioners are with their support or lack of support with the shelter. And so it depends on each community. But I would say the quickest, is 6 to 8 months.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Pizano. Okay, so here is our next question. How can we get regressive shelters to make changes? Our local open admission, nonprofit shelter has the same management and board made up of employees, practicing 30-year-old shelter practices. They are hated by their community, but are constantly taking in animals, refusing returns by retail rescues and adoption centers that have shipped these animals up from the South.
That's a good question. And, you know, this goes back to working together and listening to everybody's concerns and being respectful. So I think one good way is, number one, you could have, I think the first step is to have some sort of knowledge about what the needs are in the shelter, because going to the director or complaining to the board isn't going to get you anywhere if you're criticizing them. But approaching them and saying, how can we help? What do you need? I think really breaks the ice and brings in a different perspective, like, oh, wait a minute, you want to help. And then having something like this presentation, I think, is really good too, because it shows that there's all these life-saving potential opportunities for them. So you could provide this presentation. You could offer the Target Zero team to do a go-to presentation. But I think the first step is getting in the door is from a place in asking them how you can help as opposed to criticizing them for the things that you feel they're doing wrong.
Great answer. Here's our next question. We are required to hold feral cats for 3 days. They are then euthanized. This seems inhumane to me, and it is dangerous for the staff. What can you recommend as a better law? Property owners will not allow the cats to be TNR'd.
Right. Okay. So we recommend for any outside cat, friendly or feral, that there is no stray hold. So it does also depend on your state law, but there are states we work in, and the shelters in that state look at this return to field or community cat diversion or shelter neuter return as a return to the outside home. Most of the time when you sterilize these cats and you stabilize the population, everybody's fine. So in between, you may have certain property owners. So this says property owners will not allow the cats to be TNR. That is an experience with maybe one or several. That is not all the property owners. But again, your goal is to sterilize those cats as soon as possible so you don't have property owners complaining that there's cats everywhere. And the cats that come to the shelter that you cannot put back to that original location, then having some sort of working cat program or barn cat program is a it saves their life. It's not the best option, but it's the only option that you might have very rarely. Most of the time when you work with these property owners, you can set up a plan and find out what's happening. And guess what? If you sterilize those cats, a lot of them will go back to other places or other neighborhoods, and so you solve the problem. But I promise you it's not all the property owners where you live, and if you can't change the ordinance right now, you could look at calling that program a return, or what you should call it is return to outside home. And I do, sorry, Jesse. I was going to say,
go ahead, Dr. Pizano.
No, I also agree. It's inhumane to hold feral cats for 3 days. You know, the recommended turnaround is they might come in day 1, day 2 they're sterilized, and day 3 they're put back. But I agree it is inhumane to hold the cats, and it's dangerous for the staff. And it's very sad that so we would rather either have them put back sterilized or else relocated as a distant second choice.
Great. So we have the next question already up. When the shelters, like Waco, are decreasing their intakes, where are the animals going?
This is a great question, and maybe I should say it a different way. So several things. Remember, you're doing targeted SpayNeuter. So those animals that would have otherwise come in the shelter are not being born, and this has to do with 2 key populations: community cat diversion, so community cat sterilization, and then low-income targeted SpayNeuter. So those animals are not being born. Now, right now in Waco, those were the 2 major ways that the intake decreased. In other communities like Brevard, part of their decrease in intake is safety net. We love to see all of those pieces in place, but it's not a matter of the animals going somewhere else. They are not, those in Waco in particular, they simply were not born because we so heavily targeted those populations that were ultimately offspring were ending up in the shelter.
Thank you again, Dr. Pizano. Here's your next question. When identifying best practices, was a specific tool, for lack of a better term, used? If so, what was it, and where can we learn more about it?
Identifying best practices. No, I mean, I think these are all, like I said, it's a general core of these best practices is what all the national organizations are teaching. So you can go on any of the websites. Animalsheltering.org is HSUS, Best Friends Animal Society, Alley Cat Allies, Million Cat Challenge, so ASPCA. So the core of these practices are really what everybody is embracing. So really so many different references on all our national animal welfare organization sites. And then with respect to the ones that I chose to talk about for this presentation, really the reason that I chose these topics were because these are the ones we identified as the global strategies that we want shelters to embrace that will help them, again, productively decrease intake to the greatest degree and get them to over 90% as soon as possible.
Great. We still have time for a few more questions. So here's your next question. Regarding tipping point, the old school county and city governments define their primary mission as a public safety mission. Life saving is secondary at best. What arguments are effective tipping arguments, or do we simply need to focus on replacing the people in charge?
Oh, that's a really good question. And, well, I can tell you that Alley Cat Allies did a survey and asked in the poll, it was a Harris poll, and they asked these people that didn't want cats in their neighborhoods. 81% of the people did not want the cats euthanized. So there is information out there, but I have to say that just in general, it is palpable that euthanasia is not acceptable as population control, and that is by the majority of voters, and those are the people that put your elected officials in office. So we understand that a municipal shelter originally was not created as a life-saving mission. It was created because of public safety. But again, when you are, for example, trapping and euthanizing cats just because they're outside, even the CDC says that euthanizing a potential rabies vector does nothing for control. And now with the community cat, and this is one example, the community cat diversion program, I just increased community immunity. That protects people. So that is the public safety mission. And so that's what you need to get them to understand. And again, approach it not from like, oh, we want to save all the puppies and kittens. It has to be like, you need to implement responsible public policy. Wouldn't you want to decrease shelter intake from 10,000 to 5,000? Wouldn't that like alleviate a lot of the cost of care, et cetera? Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? That is the fiscally responsible. When I talk to elected officials, I use the term fiscally responsible or fiscally irresponsible a lot. And so talk to them with respect to how public money is being used. And it's not efficient to take in animals to a shelter and warehouse them and euthanize them, nor is it what the public wants.
Okay. How could we build on the Good Samaritan ideas you mentioned if we, a small nonprofit shelter, don't have a foster program? We do have GS who pick up pets and we can't take them, and they don't want to take to local public shelter. I'd like a better message to share.
Oh, this is a good question. So, well, what we're talking about is, and you're not encouraging Good Samaritans to come to the shelter. We're saying the Good Samaritan, we have trained them if they found XYZ, puppies, kittens, dogs, cats, to bring them to the shelter. So we're saying that Good Samaritan should be your target audience to turn into a foster volunteer right then and there with that litter or dog or cat or whoever they have found, and that when you help them with the supplies and the SpayNeuter, they are more likely to say yes. And we've seen shelters with like barely a foster program turn this idea into like a huge foster program with hundreds of foster volunteers that happened because they asked Good Samaritans. We just never asked before. But the key part is supporting those Good Samaritans and providing the supplies and services that those pets need temporarily.
Thank you, Dr. Pizano. Looks like we are coming up at the end of our time, but I'd like to put one more question out there. Here's the question. I work at an open admission, no-kill municipal shelter. We take in over 10,000 animals a year. In trying to expand the dog foster program, we are having concerns about liability and increased use of resources as we look at doubling our capacity with continued growth of the foster program. Length of stay for dogs has not decreased, as the most likely dogs to get into foster are fairly adoptable already. A lot of our applicants are interested in adopting without commitment. If they foster, then the shelter takes the responsibility of food, medical, etc. Any suggestions of how to balance this?
Oh, I get it. Oh, yes, we have seen this problem. Well, as the shelter, you're going to be the ones that are establishing the rules. And so when you're sending fosters out, there is a time limit. So, you want to empower your foster volunteers to place them. And so if they're interested in adopting them and I'm making this up, say it's 6 weeks. So at 6 weeks, then they decide whether to bring the dog back, say it's a dog, because it sounds like the issue is with dogs, or they can do the adoption paperwork, but it is not intended to milk the system. So it sounds like your foster volunteers are taking advantage of this program where at the end of the day, you have to get them into their permanent life outcome. Foster care is a temporary fix. So it's just for a quick turnaround, and I think it also sounds like you need to ramp up your adoption programs, but you need to put limits on and make very strict protocols about your foster program so that people don't take advantage of it. But we have seen that before.
Thank you, Dr. Pizano, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. With that, I believe that will be our last question for the evening. Dr. Pizano, do you have any closing statements you would like to make?
Yes, thank you again to Maddie's, and thank you so much for everybody who listened to the webinar today. And I promise you that if some of you are scratching your heads and thinking that I'm crazy, I hear you, and I was you. A lot of the things that we do and teach now was something that I didn't do way back when. So I just ask that you come to the national conferences and look online and read A Doctor's Welcome and really embrace and look at a different perspective in how we do animal sheltering today. Thank you so much again to everybody.